We could be at the precipice of what would be the most catastrophic thing that could happen in the Middle East right now. And this is in a context where there is an ongoing mass murder supported by the United States in Yemen, as well as an ongoing multi-party supported mass murder in Syria that implicates every single world power. It is absolutely, at the bare minimum, a litmus test for Democratic candidates to campaign on restoring the Iran deal, and any sort of superficial fear mongering about this government needs to be rejected outright. It doesn't mean, as with all the other places that we talked about, that we negate the reality of that government, that we deny that, as an example, just recently, a prominent women's rights attorney was just sentenced to a draconian and vicious prison sentence in Iran for speaking out on equality. This is all true, but it's also true that Iran is run by rational deal makers who followed their end of the deal. What is the United States run by? Who is Israel run by? Who is Saudi Arabia run by right now? Those answers are very disturbing, and they reveal the sort of core dangers that are posed in the Middle East today. And they don't, regardless of what we think of Tehran. And I think we should think a lot of very bad things about the Islamic Republic. But that is not where the core threat emanates from in any realistic view of the world whatsoever.
My name is Ben Burgess, and this is Give Them an Argument. Forrest Miller, I think, is going to have to take the week off, or at least the day off, but he will, I'm certain, be back. Meanwhile, I am going to be joined in a few minutes by the one and only Krystal Ball to break down the first couple weeks of the Biden administration and basically do the domestic policy version of what we did last week with the panel with Daniel Bessner, Katie Halper, and Rania Khalek, where we did a deep dive on both Biden's foreign policy record and, you know, what we could tell about what he's going to do now. But the clip that you just heard, or watched if you're watching this live on YouTube, was, of course, the late, great Michael Brooks from about a year ago, when he was talking about the Trump administration's warmongering about Iran. And the reason that I just played that for you now is because there have just been headlines that I've just seen that I've just seen on Twitter, at least, that Biden's Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has been fear-mongering about Iran being weeks away from having its own nuke. And granted, I'm mostly seeing that right now reported in the Israeli media, which has their own incentive to exaggerate everything everything that the U.S. says that sort of is helpful to them in scaremongering about the Iranian menace. Point shouldn't be exaggerated too much. There were actually people in the Israeli defense establishment who understood that the Iran deal was probably better even for them than having an all-out war. But even the people say that this is an exaggeration of Blinken's comments seem to be saying that, well, what he said is that they're maybe months away from being a few weeks away from a nuke. Whatever it may be, it certainly seems to be the case that Blinken was engaged in some fairly disturbing fear-mongering on the subject, and stuff that's very worrying, and that goes right to the heart of what Michael was saying back, in that earlier segment, from a year ago, or maybe in 2019, when he's talking about Iran. He's saying very nuanced, very smart, very Michaelish things about Iran, that obviously this is not a government that, the secular socialist left, has anything in common with or should make excuses for. But if you think that Iran is the great danger in the Middle East, you have left reality behind. That, they lived up to their end of the nuclear deal, and Trump, of course, ripped it up, and then engaged in all sorts of extra aggression towards Iran, assassinating Soleimani, etc., and brought us very close to the brink. It's why I think I was talking about this with Ronnie last week. There's something particularly absurd about giving Trump credit for not having started any new wars. It's a little bit like saying that somebody who has gone to the edge of a dry forest and launched a bunch of fireworks into the middle of the forest floor, but well, at least he didn't start any new forest fires. Yeah, okay, maybe none of the small fires the fireworks started escalated into a full-blown forest fire, but you don't get that many points for that. And very similar things apply to Trump and Iran, or Trump and North Korea before he had his big mood swing on that. But the thing is, and again, what I'm going to do with Krystal later is going to be very solidly focused on domestic policy. I wanted to get this in, at the beginning, that what Michael was saying at the end of that clip about the greatest danger being the 800-pound gorilla that is American empire tromping around the Middle East, that is the player that you need to worry the most about, is still very much true. That we shouldn't buy into the myth of Trump as some sort of right-wing isolationist who is no such thing. But Blinken's comments today are a really disturbing reminder that the Biden administration is not going to be anything you can count on to be better in that regard, or maybe better, maybe less likely to start a new war at a whim. But certainly not fundamentally different. That's the distinction. And certainly the danger of a new American war against Iran has not gone anywhere. Obviously, these claims, weeks away, months away. I mean, you could find, I'm pretty sure Bibi Netanyahu was making claims like this in 2005 and has never stopped. So obviously that shouldn't be taken seriously as anything except for an indication of where what Derek Davidson calls the blob, the foreign policy elite, where their heads are at, and in particular where decision makers in the Biden administration's heads are at. That is, it's potentially an indication of. So I wanted to start there. There are several other things I want to get to before Krystal comes on at 8. So one of them is that, as I have done the last couple weeks, I want to just share the most recent comic that our very talented graphic designer J. Andrew World has done to promote the Give Them an Argument Patreon. So it's been a series of Pulp Fiction themed comics. So let me just find that. In this, you see John Travolta and Uma Thurman at the diner in Pulp Fiction. Travolta says, "That's a pretty fucking good milkshake. I don't know if it's worth $5, but it's pretty fucking good." Thurman says, "What would you spend $5 on?" Travolta says, "That's easy. Give them an argument with Ben Burgess. The show is the shit. But for $5 gets you an extra in-depth interview every week, access to Sopranos episodes early." Thurman asks, "What's the Sopranos?" And to which Travolta responds, "Fuck if I know. This is 1994. I guess if you've never seen Pulp Fiction, that would seem like a very weird and random comic. But since I've watched that movie many times, I love that." Speaking of movies, the Wednesday, the Wednesday movie live stream. So we've been doing these movie review live streams every week. The one this Wednesday, because of course of the GameStop, GameStop drama that's been going on in the last week. So in honor of that, the movie that we're going to watch this week, and we're going to comment on, break down in that live stream on Wednesday, is going to be The Wolf of Wall Street. So that stream is going to be with our good friend Daniel Bessner, with Forrest, if he's back with us by then, I'm sure he will be, with Jacobin deputy editor Micah Utrecht, and also with philosophy professor Ryan Lake. Speaking of Professor Lake, last night ended up doing an epic 5-hour live stream because on Sunday nights we have been doing these debate breakdown live streams. So this is actually the 10th one that we've done. Been trying to alternate between more directly political ones, like we watched the James Baldwin, William F. Buckley debate, for example, and more philosophical ones. We watched Chomsky Foucault. We watched one with various IDW morons about free will and determinism and related subjects. That was a more philosophical one. We've watched a couple of debates about we've watched a couple of debates about the Iraq War. Very relevant. That Iran clip earlier, and on the more philosophical side, since a bunch of the debates that we've watched have been Christopher Hitchens' debate, last night with Ryan Lake and another philosophy professor, Mark Warren, we watched Hitchens' 2009 debate on the existence of God with William Lane Craig. I'm an atheist, but I think Craig definitely won the debate. And the one next week with frequent guest Matt McManus, we are going to watch the debate between Terry Eagleton and Roger Scruton. So again, back to a little bit more directly political, although those are both obviously theorists and not just political commentators. In any case, on Thursday, we are the episode as referenced in that comic. The Give Them an Argument Patreon is for $5 a month, so the cost of a milkshake at that 50s nostalgia diner in Pulp Fiction. You get extra episode every single week. So those always drop on Thursdays for patrons in both unlisted YouTube and in podcast form on the Patreon. And the one this week is a discussion with my Zero Books editor, Doug Lane, about tech censorship and free speech. This channel and the Zero Books channel have both had pretty recent experience with that topic. So the stream that we did on January 6th with several of those characters that I just mentioned and a couple others. So that was with Ryan Lake, Forrest, and Daniel. No, Daniel wasn't on that one. Gene Bajalan, and also Derek Varn, also from Zero Books, and that was taken down and for really absurd reasons that YouTube said that it violated their policy against suggesting that widespread fraud had changed the outcome of the election, which of course nobody on the stream came close to suggesting. In fact, it was obviously, given all those people that I mentioned, none of them are exactly Trump supporters. So it was so far from that there was a big chunk of it that was devoted to the question of whether the MAGA people who stormed the Capitol were technically fascists or not. But it was taken down for spreading Trumpist conspiracy theories. I can only assume that the algorithm was tripped up by too many keywords being used. And we filed an appeal that night, but it still hasn't been put back up yet. The Zero Books channel has had very similar experiences. So we are going to very, very soon. After the Krystal interview, we are going to have to roll a few minutes from my conversation with Doug, just a little preview of that, and then there will be a more extensive preview of a different part of it that comes out both on the YouTube channel and on the podcast feed on Thursday. And then, of course, patrons get the whole thing on Thursday. Next Monday, we are going to have Jason Miles from the This Is Revolution podcast. And there is also going to be a debate between me and Libertarian and former Libertarian Party, former candidate for the Libertarian Party presidential nomination, Adam Kokesh. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, Adam Kokesh. So anyway, the next Monday, debate between me and Adam Kokesh, and then a chat with Jason Miles from This Is Revolution. And then the next Thursday, going to be talking to Sam Adler Bell from the Know Your Enemy podcast. And we are going to be talking about an article that Sam wrote about Dr. Fauci and this sort of liberal technocratic cult of him, and why that might not be as helpful as some people think that it is. So all good stuff coming up. Meanwhile, I think Krystal is going to be on in just a moment, but we are going to take a quick break before that happens. All right, let's see. Let's do. Nope, we do not have the intermission music. It's not where it looked like it was. So let me just play this video, and we are going to be right back in just a moment. All right, I am doing this Forrest list, and Krystal does not seem to be ready quite yet. So give me a moment. There might be some more technical snags, but while we are waiting for her, I want to watch a video that is related to the main topic, but is a little bit at 90 degrees from it. So this is a video from The Intercept to kind of warm us up on the Biden stuff. So this is called "Joe Biden Faces Questions Over Claims of Civil Rights Activism."
When I marched in the civil rights movement, I did not march with a 12-point program. I marched with tens of thousands of others to change attitudes. We changed attitudes.
When I was 17 years old, like many of you, I participated in sit-ins to desegregate the restaurants and movie houses of Wilmington, Delaware.
I came out of the civil rights movement. I was one of those guys that sat in and marched and all that stuff.
During the 60s,
I was, in fact, very concerned about the civil rights movement. I was not an activist. I worked at an all-black swimming pool in the east side of Wilmington, Delaware. I was involved. I was involved in what they were thinking, what they were feeling. I was involved, but I was not out marching. I was not down in Selma. I was not anywhere else. I was a suburbanite kid who got a dose of exposure to what was happening to Black Americans when I'm in my own city.
You know, when I was a teenager in Delaware, for real, I got involved in the civil rights movement. We have the 8th largest Black population in America. Most people don't know that. And I'd go to 8 o'clock Mass, then I'd go to Reverend Herring's church where we'd meet in order to organize and figure where we were going to go, whether we were going to desegregate the Rialto movie theater or what we were going to do. I got my education for real in the Black church. And that's not hyperbole, it's a fact. But I got my education, Reverend Doc, in the Black church, not a joke. Because when we used to get organized on Sundays to go out and desegregate movie theaters and things like that, we do it through the Black church. I was no big shakes, Reverend, in the civil rights movement. I was just a kid. I got involved in desegregated movie theaters and helping, you may remember Reverend Moyer in Delaware and Herman Holloway organized voter registration drives, coming out of Black churches on Sundays, figuring how we were going to move. In October, I was invited to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis to receive the Freedom Award. A thing when I sat in Black churches in the east side of Wilmington getting ready to, and by the way, next to two Jewish rabbis, getting ready to go out and desegregate movie theaters in Delaware. I never, ever thought in my life I would be worthy of, and I'm still not sure I'm worthy of it.
Tied up in a filibuster.
That's right.
Senator Lowell Weicker is filibustering against a couple of anti-busing amendments. It used to be that the filibuster was a tool of Southern conservatives to be used to halt desegregation. It has turned around now to become a tool to try to continue desegregation, if one could put it that way. Do you support that filibuster, even though it's holding up some legislation that you'd like to see on the floor?
It's strange. I support the filibuster that's going on for a while. The reason I say for a while is I happen to be one of those so-called people are labeled as a liberal on civil rights, but oppose busing. And I support the effort to curtail the ability of courts to bus. And the strange thing is that had the filibuster been broken yesterday, it would have stripped amendment from this bill. So there was a strange convergence of opinion. Liberals, pro-bussers and anti-bussers voted against ending the filibuster because one of the elements of the anti-busing provision would have been stripped away. Because what happens when, as you know better than most, when a filibuster is broken and cloture is invoked, non-germane amendments no longer can be discussed. And a busing amendment is non-germane to this particular bill. So I guess the least confusing way to say it is, I don't like filibusters. I have not been supportive of filibusters in my 9 years in the Senate used by either liberals or conservatives. And on the issue that the argument is about, and that is whether or not busing serves is A, required constitutionally, and B, has a utilitarian value for desegregation, I come down on the side of A, it is not constitutionally required, and B, it is not a useful tool.
But if you would strip the courts of that power to order busing, what would stop some other senators then from stripping the power of the courts in abortion?
I think
stop some other senators then.
Important, if I could suggest, Ron, to point out that A, this proposal does not strip the court of the power to order busing, or even more importantly, it does not strip the court of the power to impose a remedy where they found a constitutional violation. No one is suggesting that. Where the court has said that, at least I'm not suggesting that, where the court has concluded that a school board has said that, at least I'm not suggesting that, where the court has concluded that a school district, a state, or a particular area has intentionally attempted to, could and must declare that to be unconstitutional, and thereby move from there to impose a remedy to correct the situation. What I have argued as one who grew up in the civil rights movement and ran for office as a public defender and a member of an active participant in civil rights cases, I have argued that the least effective remedy to be imposed is the busing remedy. You have a remedy of altering school district lines. You have the remedy of ordering construction of new schools. You have the remedy of change the particular provision within the law that prevented the movement of black students into a white school area. But what has happened is the courts, as a consequence of 25 years of recalcitrance, primarily in the part of the South, and very inventive methods on the part of the South to get around the unitary school requirement, that is continuing setting up dual school systems. And if you look at the cases, in my opinion, in frustration, the court evolved a remedy that said, look, if 50% of this city of Dunlap, South Carolina is black, and you have two schools in Dunlap, all white and one is all black, something's rotten in Dunlap. So I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to just look all white and one is all black. Something's rotten in Dunlap. So I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to just look at that and put the burden on you. If 50% of the city is black, then 50% of the school. By that rationale to the north, where you had integrated facilities by and large, but segregated living areas as a consequence of migratory patterns and developments in the areas, but segregated living areas as a consequence of migratory patterns and developments in the area. That is just like when Irish moved, they went into Irish ghettos, and Jews into Jewish ghettos, etc. In the South, after the Emancipation Proclamation, the slaves didn't move off the plantation.
Excuse me, can I just interrupt you there? You draw parallels between Jews moving into Jewish ghettos, Italians into Italian ghettos, and blacks into black ghettos. Isn't Jewish ghettos, Italians into Italian ghettos, and blacks into black ghettos? Isn't there a difference? Wasn't there among earlier ethnic groups a certain amount of, if you call it, if you will, self-segregation, that they like to live the ghettos and out and leaving blacks in ghettos?
I don't.
Do they choose the ghettos?
I don't mean to overstate that. I was talking about the early patterns of migration to the north in the early 20s and 30s. As a matter of fact, we went even further, Dan, as you know. What happened was there were many laws. Dan, as you know, what happened was there were many laws in many northern states that said black folks must live here. They can't live anywhere else. But the point I was trying to make is when you're trying to remedy the situation in an area where you had black, white living in the same block, it made a great deal of sense. But where you ended up with disparate neighborhoods, long distances apart, but were segregated, and you tried to integrate the facilities, you created a number of mechanical problems of significance.
So before we finish the segment, I'm going to have to find out not whether or not you think that busing is the best way to achieve desegregation, but whether, given that the courts do use busing as a tool, you support these two amendments by Senator Helms and Senator Johnston. Do you support those amendments which would have the effect of cutting off funds and otherwise preventing the Justice Department from even dealing in this tool?
Well, it doesn't prevent them from dealing in it, but I think the Johnson Amendment's not a very good amendment. Not for constitutional reasons, but for practical reasons. When you get into deciding minutes and distances, it doesn't work. And one of my problems with the Johnston Amendment, it will be only a Band-Aid. It will make it appear as though we've dealt with the busing issue, but we really will not have dealt with the busing issue.
You support the Helms Amendment?
No, I don't think the Helms Amendment is a particularly useful one, but I think it's important that, and I'm not sure it would be held constitutional, to tell you the truth, but I do think that it's important that the entire United States Senate and Congress go on record to telling the courts that you got to find other remedies.
All right. That was the President of the United States, Joe Biden, earlier in his career, talking about subjects that he's notoriously, very good on.
Champion of Black America, Joe Biden, reliving a little history there. I was saying to you, anytime he starts talking about race, even to the present day, I just start getting extremely nervous because it oftentimes goes off the rails, as we saw with the like "you ain't black" comments during the campaign. Just one memory in particular.
Yeah, I have to say, Biden, it does have in common with the previous president that, like, he has so many weird utterances that, like, whenever you hear one that you haven't heard for a while, it's like, oh yeah, that was like 3 years ago, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, look, they're obvious. I don't want to overplay like the similarities, and so people go, "Oh, she's saying Biden and Trump are the same." They're not the same, obviously, but there are some like sort of central characteristics of their personalities that are a little bit similar. Like, I think about it most often with foreign policy, where neither one of them has any sort of like really fully formed ideology. It's all very relationship based. And they both, and this is relevant to today's news, actually, I think they both have this unearned confidence in their own ability to like strike a deal just through the sheer force of their charisma and personality, that may be actually the ultimate testament to white male privilege right there. But yeah, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, they're going to come to the day. They're going to work with me. I'm going to get a great deal with them. I know these guys. It's going to be fine. Which, of course, something we saw very much with Donald Trump as well. So there you go. My thought.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm, of course, joined by Krystal Ball, who is the co-host of The Rising, and since the last time she was on this show, is now a co-host of something else. Do you want to plug the new show?
Yeah, of course I want to plug the new show. Krystal, Kyle and Friends, new podcast with Kyle Kalinske, which is really fun. We're doing it once a week. And it's an opportunity for us to have these kind of longer conversations with people that we're just both find really interesting. And the place to find that, I mean, the audio version of it, you can find on any of the normal podcast places, Apple, Spotify, wherever else people get podcasts. And then if you want to get the video, you subscribe over at Substack. And there's also a newsletter that goes out. So if you don't, it's $5 a month to get the video, but if you don't want to pay that, you can still sign up over at Substack. And there's a newsletter that comes out that sort of, tells you who's coming up and some of our early thoughts on the week. And there's a little write around from the video and all that good stuff. But yeah, it's really fun to do. I'm enjoying it a lot.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. So we got a little, get a little taste of part of Biden's history on some of this stuff. We kind of did a deep dive, last week on some of the foreign policy stuff. We got to see, Biden calling for the invasion of Iraq and then lying about it over and over and over again. When it came up, we saw Biden, fear like whatever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to talk a little bit more now about the domestic stuff. So I think that lead in with Biden's history of race, might be useful, because if you watched the his inaugural address, which was, very weird in a lot of ways, like he said that the pursuit of bipartisan unity was going to be as important to him as the end of slavery was to Lincoln. Actual thing he said in the inaugural. But he also talked about, systemic racism. He used this phrase a couple times, that he wants to do something about systemic racism. And so you'd think that meant that whatever he did about that would have been systemic.
Right.
But so far as I can tell, what he's done with executive orders has mostly, been along the lines of, taking the 1776 report off a government website, which is nice, but, purely symbolic. Having people form a new interagency thing to, like, refine the collection, methods for how to measure diversity and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's all kind of been like that. And what are the things that Biden actually could be doing right now? Maybe, just starting with the race and criminal justice stuff, like what could he be doing right now if he wanted to?
Well, if we want to start with criminal justice, he did an executive order with a lot of fanfare about ending private prison contracts, federal level. That's great. That's great. Yeah. That's progress. Glad to see it. But with every single one of these executive orders, and I have really done my homework on these because I don't want to be a hater. I really want to give him credit when he deserves credit, like good private prisons at the federal level. That's great. But I really literally feel like every time I dig into one of these things, I end up coming away disappointed because I was set to be like, this is great. This is progress. This is important. And then you dig in and you find out, well, there's only 3 contracts to start with. And it doesn't include immigration detention, which is a more sizable part of the population. So even this, you're like, okay, good. It's better than it was, but it's also not all that it could be. We just had over the summer, obviously, the largest protest movement in the nation's history. And at the federal level, we've seen literally nothing in response to that. I think at the local level, activists have been able to secure quite a number of wins. Actually, I don't want to invisibilize that at all. But at the federal level, we've gotten, Pelosi and co kneeling in kente cloth. And we had the really embarrassing spectacle of going into the critical Senate races in Georgia, it being reported that everyone's going, hey, let's not even say the word police, right? Let's not even go there whatsoever. So we're not even going to talk about considering to do anything on that front. But, it's also, and this is not, I'm not criticizing your framing of this, but it also really annoys me when people equate racial justice just with criminal justice, right? If Biden was serious about racial equity and closing the racial wealth gap, then we would have Medicare for all. If he was serious, then we would cancel student debt, right? If he was serious, then we would not be begging for $1,400 when you promised $2,000 immediately. Now it's like $1,400 maybe when we get to it and we're going to keep negotiating it down. No, you would be doing $2,000 a month, every month, at least for the duration of the pandemic, as they've done in places like Canada and other places, and which is not some radical left-wing idea. It's an idea that's supported by an overwhelming majority of the American people. So if you were actually serious about these issues, those are the sort of steps that you would take, all of which, this is not fantasy land, 100% of the things that I just mentioned are 100% within Biden's control. And yet there's no prayer of any of that actually happening. So I think that tells you the seriousness with which he and the Democratic Party establishment in general take the issue.
Yeah, so I think it's right to say that all of the, if you care about, equalizing the life outcomes of Americans from different racial backgrounds, then, and if that's not what he means by what he talks about systemic racism, then I literally don't know what it means. But if that's what you care about, then yes, absolutely, all of those issues would be part of it. But even in the narrower way it was off, construed that, that when there was that, kneeling in kente cloth, that was, that was about, policing and, and all of that. That was the context that happened in. And it is an incredibly restrictive way to talk about that. I think that's totally right. But even just, sticking with that, before we get to, the healthcare and, and stimulus checks and all of those other things, this seems like, there is a whole lot more that the president could unilaterally do on this besides just canceling 3 private prison contracts.
You think? Hey, how about you deschedule marijuana? How about we start there? How about you deschedule some other things while you're at it? If there's one thing that is central to the system of mass incarceration, which Joe Biden himself helped integrally to construct and certainly knows a thing about, it is the war on drugs. So if you actually want to make changes, if you're actually serious about these things and not doing the kente cloth equivalent, that's where you start, right? That's where you go to. And we haven't heard anything about that so far, Ben.
Yeah, right. And also, besides descheduling marijuana, I mean, like he could, I mean, public federal prisons, he could release anybody he wanted, to release. He has that power to presidential pardon. And so, there could be mass releases of nonviolent offenders, tomorrow, if he wanted to. Although, I think there's a larger context here, which is why would you think that he wanted to, given that throughout his entire history, pretty much leading up to becoming president, he, certainly the entire time he was in the Senate, he was one of the biggest war on drugs hawks in the Senate. He was pushing for ever more draconian, laws about all of that stuff. And I know that the more sympathetic interpretation of Biden you get, and I mean, it actually says something about how bad the record is that this is the more sympathetic interpretation. He's just an opportunist. He doesn't really believe any of that. That's so he could go either way. It doesn't really matter. He'll just go whichever way.
That's the best possible case. Actually, I mean, I kind of buy the case, to be honest with you. I honestly think he's always tried to find whatever the center of political gravity was in Washington. And the center of political gravity in Washington is always a terrible place to be, right? I mean, that's where wars are started, bad trade deals are passed, and, drug wars are started, and mass incarceration is increased, and these terrible, wrong-headed, tough on crime crap. That's all in the center of political gravity. And that's where he's always tried to sort of situate himself. I mean, going back to some of what we were saying at the beginning about him and Trump and their similarities, I do think very central to his self-conception is this idea that I work across the aisle. I think that's really core. To the extent that he has an ideology, I think that's the thing that you just can't break him of, which is a disaster, because we see the results playing out right now, even after 8 years of seeing that the Republicans have no intent of working with you in good faith on anything, that in fact they've set out to destroy you and your presidency and undermine any potential progress that could inure to your benefit. There's still all this, at least on the surface level, symbolic. We're going to meet with them. We're going to negotiate with them. We're taking their plan seriously on relief, rather than just a really clear-headed, here's what we need, here's what we're going to do. And we're going to put the screws to anyone in our own party who isn't going to go along with us. So, and this is the other thing that, I really think about, this right-wing group that came up of Republicans that came up with their alternative relief plan. I use that word very loosely here. They immediately get an invite to the White House. Well, Ilhan Omar and a lot of other progressives authored a letter saying that, hey, we need to do more. We need to have $2,000 recurring checks. I haven't seen their invite to the White House yet. And I don't actually put that 100% on Biden, because the bottom line is the Republicans and the Manchins of the world are willing to walk away and not vote for the deal. And even in sending this letter, the progressives said up front, look, this isn't going to hold back our support. So they're not really giving him a reason for having to meet with them and having to negotiate on the progressive side of the lever of the ledger. The only people who are really willing to play hardball here are the right wingers. And so that's kind of how you end up. Now, the more charitable interpretation there, which I do want to grant, is people like Ilhan Omar and AOC and Bernie, who I think has played a little bit more hardball at this point than others, they actually care about the result, right? They actually want people to get relief. And so the fact that they have morals and values is kind of weaponized against them, because it's oh, well, you can't stand in the way of this deal, right? People need this help. And they're like, God, people really do need this help. And I really don't want to be the one standing in the way of that deal. And I do believe that they come from that good and moral place, but ultimately their willingness to just sort of send the strongly worded letter without putting any muscle behind it leads to an inferior result for everyone.
Right. And when we talk about that result, I mean, this is something you mentioned earlier, but I mean, it's really worth like circling and underlining a couple times, that the argument that, you know, during the election, there were literally ads that ran in Georgia with images of $2,000 checks in them. And then after the election, they flipped to saying, oh, what we really meant was $1,400 checks. Because if you think about it, and you always know it's going to be a political winner when you start with, if you think about it, that's really like having a $2,000 check, because it adds with the $600 that you already spent in December. And so it's like $2,000.
That's some delicious Democratic messaging right there, isn't it? If you add the 14 with the $600 that you previously may have received, you'll see that it equals up to $2,000. It's like, oh my God, what are you doing right now? And then I have to say, like, I consider myself to be kind of fairly cynical at this point. You know, like, I didn't expect much from the Biden administration. I still don't expect much from the Biden administration. And yet, when he was so clear in Georgia of like, you will get $2,000 immediately, I actually believed it. I really thought,
Yeah,
like,
it seemed like that might be the one thing they do. That, I mean, knowing that, given with the way the Democrats are, they'll probably be like, yeah, you get a $2,000 check, then nothing for the next 4 years, and they'd tell you should be grateful for the $2,000, but you at least thought they're going to get the $2,000.
Yes, and you know what? People are so beaten down, and the last 4 years have been so terrible, and especially the last year. And God, everyone just like wants to breathe for a minute. That if you did a good job with the vaccine and you just gave people the damn $2,000 you promised, I think you'd have a sky high approval rating. I don't think it would last. I think that ultimately, like, the structural issues that brought us to this place, that brought us Donald Trump, that created skyrocketing inequality, that created all of this anxiety and unrest and turmoil that we're witnessing in society, like, that's not going anywhere anytime soon. But in the short term, I think if you gave people the checks that you promised and you did a good job with vaccines, you'd be set for the midterms, especially with the way that the Republicans are like doing everything they can possibly to self-implode right now. So I just didn't have the creativity or the nihilism to imagine that they'd be like, wait a second, what we really meant was 1,400, number one, and number two, March, April, sometime, and let's talk with the Republicans about maybe it should really be 1,000. Maybe we should means test it more. Like, I genuinely, it genuinely blows my mind, because even a lot of Wall Streeters and the big corporate donors are like, give people their money because we need them to spend it, and we need this economy to like keep going, and our stocks to keep going up and all that stuff. And so it's just kind of mind-boggling to me that they are doing everything they can to reduce the amount that they can get away with sending to the American people. And I do think that they'll pay a massive political price. People were promised $2,000, and you can do lots of other good stuff. And I want to be clear, like, they're planning on some other potentially good stuff. We'll see what the details are when they eventually get it together and get this stuff done. But if on the one really clear thing that you promised, you end up kind of weaseling your way out of, I don't think that's a good look whatsoever.
Yeah, it's definitely not. I do want to switch gears and watch just a little bit more Biden. I promise we won't have to watch any more Biden after this.
To build the consensus in this country, because the real problem is going to be taking on those insurance companies, because they're going to be the ones. You're going to have Harry and Louise. Remember those ads with Harry and Louise out there saying this is awful what the Democrats are proposing. And so the second thing is you got to provide for. I think everyone should essentially be able to be, from age 1 on, essentially have the same kind of coverage you have in Medicare. It should be just universal across the board. We can afford to do that.
It's no secret that I support Medicare for all.
I don't. I understand the appeal of Medicare for all, but folks supporting it should be clear that it means getting rid of Obamacare. And I'm not for that. I was sworn into the United States Senate next to a hospital bed. My wife and daughter, they've been killed in a car crash. And lying in that bed were my 2 surviving little boys. I couldn't imagine what it would have been like if we didn't have the health care they needed immediately. 40 years later, one of those little boys, my son Bo, was diagnosed with terminal cancer and given only months to live. I can't fathom what would have happened if the insurance companies had said for the last 6 months of his life, you're on your own. The fact of the matter is, healthcare is personal to me. Obamacare is personal to me. When I see the president try to tear it down and others propose to replace it and start over, that's personal to me too. We got to build on what we did because every American deserves affordable health care. I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message. Here, you have 160 million people who negotiated their health care plans with their employer, like many of you have. You may or may not like it. If you don't like it, you can move into the public option that I propose in my plan. But if you like it, you shouldn't have Washington dictating to you. You cannot keep the plan you have. So the 160 million people who have busted their neck, walked down picket lines, gave up pay, took hits in order to get significant health care available, you get to keep it under my plan. You don't have to give it up. It costs $30 trillion. Let's get that straight. $30 trillion over 10 years. Some say it costs $20 trillion. Some say it costs $40. What's a revolution going to do? Disrupt everything in the meantime? Look, the senator talks about his Medicare for all. He still hasn't told you how he's going to ever get it passed. He hasn't told you how, in fact, there's any possibility of that happening. He hadn't told you how much it's going to cost. He hadn't tell you how it's going to apply. It doesn't kick in for 4 years, even after it passes. We want a revolution. Let's act now. And Bernie still hasn't answered the question. How much is it going to cost? Who's going to pay for it? He talks about this savings. You know, in Vermont, they did pass the Affordable Care Act. They did pass Medicare for all. It doubled the income tax of the state. It put a 14% tax on income, withholding tax, and they got rid of it.
Throughout the Democratic primary, you made clear your opposition to single-payer, Medicare for all, and you have won the nomination. But in recent months, 20 million Americans have lost their jobs and many have lost their health insurance with it. Democrats overwhelmingly support Medicare for all. And it's especially popular among young people. And even your friend, Barack Obama, said recently that it is a good idea.
Democrats aren't just running on good old ideas, they're running on good new ideas, like Medicare for all.
So my question is, do you see a future where health insurance is no longer tied to employment? Will America ever have a single-payer system where health care is guaranteed as a human right?
Health care guaranteed is a human right, but taking away the right to have a private plan if you want a private plan, I disagree with.
It was painful.
Yeah, every part of that was painful, but that is what he has been consistently arguing. So you at least can't fault him for not sticking with it. But what he's sticking with here is pretty evil. That we're keeping a system of private for-profit health insurance in the middle of an unprecedented global pandemic. And I mean, obviously, all the arguments that he's making in there are that he's made, in that montage are absurd. But what could he be doing right now if he wanted to? If Damascus moment tomorrow, and he decided, actually, no, I don't want to preserve the American health insurance system. I think that we can have what they've had in decades in Canada without it leading to catastrophe. What could he do right now to give people health care?
I mean, Bernie Sanders was reportedly exploring emergency health insurance for the universal health care during the pandemic. And, it's very much and he believes you could do that through budget reconciliation. I think that's probably the case because you can do anything through budget reconciliation that has an impact on the budget. I am quite sure that healthcare has an impact on the budget of the United States government. And it is very much my strong belief that once everyone has universal access to healthcare, regardless of their employment status, they're not going back. So that would be one really easy, really straightforward. And then what people would say is, oh yeah, but don't forget, you got Joe Manchin, you got Kirsten Sinema. You know what? Go to their state. Make them answer to the people who don't have healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. Even Joe Manchin, we saw the way that he turned on a dime when he had a tiny bit of pressure placed on him regarding the direct stimulus checks. I mean, West Virginia is one of the poorest states in the entire country. You don't think people there want health insurance? I can promise you, and I've looked at the polling on this, that they 100% do. So use the bully pulpit rather than using it to like shame progressives and, and get them in line. Use it to put pressure on conservative Democrats, right-wing Democrats in your own party to get the American people what they deserve. And you know what? The media may make you a villain, the corporate interest may make you a villain, but the people will be 100% with you. To get in a shameless plug here for Krystal, Kyle, and friends, we had Thomas Frank on, incredible historian, author, personally, he's one of the biggest influence of my own political views. And he was talking about, with FDR, it was like 85% of newspapers endorsed against him. Every single elite interest despised him, right? Whether it was financial elites, political elites, academia, and all of the media elites, all of these newspaper editorial boards, they despised him. And that was precisely a core part of why people loved him so much. But you just see you really see zero willingness from any Democrat to actually position themselves in that way. But look, I think your question is incredibly important because, it's a hard balance when you're evaluating what's happening in the Biden administration. You see okay, maybe they're going to do this $1.9 trillion relief bill through reconciliation. We'll see whether they decide to push and do $15 minimum wage, which would be a great improvement by 2025, by the way. And in the same respect, we have to hold in our head what they could be doing. And now that they have, the House, the Senate, and the White House, there is a massive array of structural problems that they could be addressing if they actually cared to. And healthcare is among those things. Obviously, canceling debt, student debt and medical debt. Those are also, those are readily available to them. So the decision not to do those things is an active choice. And I think that's something that's important to always hold in our head and not lower the bar just because we have such low expectations for Joe Biden. We need to understand, and this is actually consistent with the bar that he has himself set. He says he wants to restore the soul of the nation, right? He wants to build back better. He's hung a gigantic portrait. The center focal point in the Oval Office is a portrait of FDR. So he's setting that standard of we need to not just put the little Band-Aid, the smallest possible Band-Aid that we can on what is a gaping wound created by the coronavirus, both health and economic crisis. We need to hold him to the standard of meeting this moment in history when clearly the neoliberal Reaganomics era and that regime has completely broken down here and around the world. We need a new paradigm. And he's held himself down as being up to the task. So far, the best we're getting is a little bit of a bigger Band-Aid that we're supposed to be yay, this is amazing.
Yeah. And but as you were saying, I was just thinking, I still, I think everything you just said is right, but God, that slogan, "Build Back Better," you could just feel the room full of consultants
in my brain.
Okay, build back. No, we can't just say "build back" because that's "build back better." There we go. It's fine.
Got to get the three. Oh, it's better than 1,400 plus 600. If you'll recall, we sent you a check before. It's better than that.
Really, it's really the same. Which is amazing. I mean, I don't know if you saw this. There was a article in the San Francisco Examiner today. There was this there was this insane op-ed by someone who was saying that Bernie Sanders wearing like a heavy coat and mittens to the inauguration showed his privilege because it was, I don't know, a historic occasion, and whatever. I'm not even sure I understand how that argument is supposed to work, but that showed his privilege, because he wasn't, he was willing to wear this coat, that, he was willing to not dress up for the occasion, and somebody who is less privileged would have felt the need to dress up. I think that's how that was supposed to go. But if you really talk about privilege, Sid, why are you upset? $1,500, $2,000. It's basically the same thing, as if like $600 more or less was just something that should be completely insignificant to everyone, is a pretty amazing testament to privilege.
That is well said, my friend. And, I thought David Sorota made a good point on rising, which is like, look, even if you're charitable and say there was some ambiguity about whether it's 2,000 or 1,400, like even if you grant them that, which I really don't, because as you said, Warnock was putting up Facebook ads that had a picture of a $2,000 check, not a 1,400 and you got your $600 earlier check, a $2,000 check. Like that was the common conception. But even if you grant them that there was some ambiguity, like, what are you doing seizing on that ambiguity to rip people off? Why would you do that? Like, you're supposed to be the party of the people. Shouldn't you be seizing on that ambiguity to make the checks as large as possible? I would be seizing on that ambiguity to say, you know what, $2,000 this month is so popular. We got to keep this going until we get this pandemic licked and we get people to the other side of it. And then we're going to take a look and see where we are and what people need to go from there. Why aren't you seizing the ambiguity to go in that direction rather than being like, well, I think we can get away with giving them only 1,400. So that's what we're going to do. And, I don't want to harp on this issue. I feel like I talk about it a lot, but I just feel like there's so much contained in this one thing. Like, this is the crux of why people don't trust politicians. It shows that. It shows also, as you were alluding to, how completely wildly out of touch they are. Not only that you scale it back to 1,400, but that you think that immediate means 3 months from now.
Right.
Like, do you been in a position? Do you know anyone who has been in a position where they're trying to make rent?
Yeah, you think that $1,400 3 months from now and $2,000 right now are basically the same thing.
For people who are struggling and like, how am I going to put it together this week and like keep the lights on and not get evicted and all, like, put food on the table? How do you think that those people can just casually like wait 3 months for less than what was ultimately anticipated? That's really been the story. It's been one of the stories, at least, of this entire crisis. The total lack of urgency, the total lack of understanding of what people are going through right now in this moment, because it has been this K-shaped recovery where the impact and the crisis is so concentrated among, the bottom half and certainly the bottom quarter of Americans in terms of income, that, these Nancy Pelosi eating her ice cream from her beautiful, like, $10,000 fridge or whatever, they just don't have any actual connectivity, visceral connectivity with these communities, which is, part of why I get excited when I see someone like a Cori Bush coming into Congress who viscerally understands what that experience is like, has been homeless herself, has known what it's like to not be able to provide the stability and the life for her kids and the pain of that struggle, like bringing that experience with you into Congress. That's why I'm so excited about someone like Nina Turner, who's just like a totally, laser focused champion for working people every single chance that she gets, no matter what the obstacle. But the vast majority of these people, they're millionaires. They haven't seen or understood the struggle in a long, long, long time. And that's not saying you have to be like working class to be a good ally. I just think it's really endemic to this system that we've constructed where, the rich are living completely different lives, completely divorced from what the people who are struggling in this pandemic have actually gone through, and they don't see it, they don't understand it. They feel like, hey, 3 months from now, it's close enough.
Yeah, and on on the healthcare part of all of this, I mean, I think because what you're talking about earlier is that thinking about what they actually could be doing is important because actually, if they'd lost those elections in Georgia, then they'd have the golden excuse, for years of the Republicans. They don't have that. Now they've got the excuse of Joe Manchin, but it's all, but which I think is good, because that's a much thinner excuse that than we don't control the Senate at all. But if that was really the way, like if you had that bill to temporarily provide everybody with with health access to Medicare as an emergency measure, until the end of the pandemic, and it really was just like Joe Manchin and like one or two other people voted, one or two other Democrats, joining Republicans in voting against it. I mean, it's because that's going to be the excuse for not doing it. It is maybe important to try to play that out. How would that go if everybody, and I know that sometimes I think we can have wishful thinking about this and think that people are going to punish politicians for things much more than they really will. But that really does seem like if voters in West Virginia know that Joe Manchin is literally the only thing standing between them and having health insurance, I've got to think that the way that played out in public opinion in West Virginia, the way that played out in the polls, would have to start looking pretty dire for him really quickly.
I absolutely think so. I mean, and that's the answer, is you have to make people like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, rather than right now, the attitude towards them is oh, they're poor thing, that we have to protect them, right? There's special flag. We have to make sure they can continue to win their elections. It's no, actually, the fact that they're in a precarious place, and maybe, if they're up for re-election sometime soon, that's your leverage. That's what you use. That's what you wield to get your agenda, especially the unbelievably popular parts of your agenda, passed. So it's a completely backwards way of thinking. These aren't special little babies that need to be protected. These are powerful political actors who are making cynical political decisions, and you need to force them to make a different cynical political decision. And West Virginia happens to be a state that I know a lot about the politics of. I've spent a lot of time there. Both as a child, my family's from there, and working in politics. And, I think people kind of misunderstand the state a lot. It's a very populous state in a lot of ways. I was actually just reviewing the polling for a radar I did on Rising, specifically around West Virginia. You have 60-some% that support federal government green job spending, just to totally obliterate it's a bunch of coal miners who just are wedded to fossil fuels mindset that a lot of people have when it comes to West Virginia. Also, look, I'm not going to say that it's perfect and there's no racism and sexism. I've seen both of those things, endemic in West Virginia. There's no doubt about it. But a large majority said racism and policing is a really significant issue. So even on some of the social cultural issues, the polling is not reflective of the public perception of the state. On a lot of, on guns, on abortion, mixed views on immigration, but they certainly were in favor of building the wall. Very, very conservative on those issues. And those are the issues that Joe Manchin has used to pander on. He famously shot up a copy of the cap and trade bill in a campaign ad. Do you remember that? That was kind of his claim to fame for a while. But if you poll on economic issues, they are actually left of where the nation as a whole is. So on healthcare, for example, they are somewhat left of where the nation as a whole is in terms of universal single payer healthcare, in terms of lifting the minimum wage. they are relatively progressive. A strong majority supports lifting the minimum wage. Certainly, if you polled on $2,000 checks, I know it would be wildly popular. If you poll even on something amorphous like should the government be doing more or less? This was from a Fox News poll on election night. A majority of West Virginians say, hey, the government should actually be doing more to help people in this country. So on economics, West Virginians, and you look, they voted overwhelmingly for Bernie Sanders in the primary against Hillary Clinton, by the way. And maybe sexism played some role, but that was not the only thing going on there. There is a populist economic strain in the state of West Virginia that could be wielded very effectively against Joe Manchin. And this is an area where I think a lot of the national political commentariat and also the national political office holders are kind of, they're completely disconnected that you could have those two things together. People who are really socially conservative, but also have these more left-leaning, they're really moderate economic positions, but more left-leaning in terms of American political context, economic positions. So you've got a place where Joe Manchin is at odds with his base. That, again, is political leverage that if you wanted to use, rather than worrying about protecting Joe Manchin, if you worried about protecting the people of his state and the people of this country, that is the way that you would ultimately think about it.
Yeah, and by the way, I love that when Bernie won West Virginia, like that idea that that was like just sexism is all that is really weird, because as I recall in 2008, Hillary Clinton won West Virginia, so I guess the sexism wasn't as strong at that point. And
that's a great point.
I know
the racism controlled in 2008.
Okay,
this time
so
they defaulted.
That the sexism in 2016, but people who are just purely motivated by nothing but racism and sexism, that's all that is all that's in their minds, that's all that impacts their voting behavior. People like that love like old Jewish men with strong New York accents. Those are their favorite people. So
right.
That's why Bernie Sanders came on top. Had absolutely nothing to do with his policies, healthcare, minimum wage, any of those things. Just sexism, because that was a sexism year, and 2008 was a racist.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, if there's one thing that white supremacists love, it's Jewish people. That's what I've been led to believe. That's my understanding of how this works, right? Based on those primary results. Makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. So
I'm going to get you demonetized. Sorry, Ben.
Yeah. Nobody told the West Virginians about the space laser. All right, Krystal. This is really good. This is always really good. Really appreciate it. You want to tell people one more time where they can find the new show?
Yep. Go over to Substack. That's a place you can sign up for free and get the newsletter and the audio. If you pay $5 a month, you also get the video, and you get a day early too, by the way. Oh, and I have a fantastic tease for this week in particular. Our guest this Friday is going to be the one and only Noam Chomsky. So pretty excited about that. Yeah. I'm very excited. I've gotten to interview him one time before, which was really cool and very intimidating. Kyle has never gotten to speak with him, and he's one of Kyle's, biggest role models and heroes. I don't think he would mind me saying that. So he's also super, super excited. So it should be great.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Krystal.
Thanks, Ben. Great to see you.
Bye. All right. That was Krystal Ball, co-host of Rising on the Hill, and also co-host now of Krystal, Kyle and Friends. Both of those shows. And in a few minutes, I'm going to be speaking to David Griscom for Outlaws and Revolutionaries. But before then, I just want to give you a short preview of my conversation with Zero Books editor Doug Lane about tech censorship and free speech. So let me see. I think doing this Forrest list, but I think we are about.
Understand why seeing their enemies punished could be considered anything but.
Has to do with, and before I say this, I'm almost to the repressive apparatus of the state here, but like what you would think that you after the 2016 election, that like essentially what the gatekeepers' respectability decided, and even most big media institutions decided, was that where they went wrong was that they didn't say that Trump was wrong and bad enough. If they had done that, this wouldn't have happened. And it is remarkable. I mean, like how weirdly much they've overcorrected for that in the last few years.
I think they said it plenty before the election. I think they said it maybe even too much before the election. Do you know how many newspaper endorsements Trump got before the election in 2016? One.
Oh, what was it?
I don't know. It was some small town, nothing to know. But I mean, every other newspaper in the country either didn't endorse it all or endorsed Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, which is so it's like there's something very weird about that like that they just said that like this idea, and maybe it's cynical on behalf of the media organizations, but I mean certainly legions of people clearly sincerely believe this.
Ever hear that he's good, and so they won't have that thought because that thought will be unexpressed.
Right. Which, okay, that does take us back to the free speech issue,
Right.
Because the certainly the motivation there is the same as the censorship motivation, and it's a very I mean it's a very weird theory. I mean, like the whole thing. I mean I've always thought like taking Parler down for like the 3 days or whatever that it was taken down before they found a new server was a very weird thing to do, like given the stated motivations, because if you think that like people kept saying, oh my God, this was being openly plotted, on Parler, and now I understand that it actually is much maybe more of the plotting happened on Facebook, but whatever, like, all right. I mean, just on a super from a law enforcement perspective, I would think that the ideal situation for plotting would be that it be done openly.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. I recall that my son Ben was involved in a protest at the University of Oregon, and after it was over, a bunch of people were suspended or were threatened with suspension. And the people who were suspended or threatened with suspension were the people who talked about what they were going to do openly on Facebook. And the administration just went to Facebook, saw what they had said, and then went after them. So it was a lot easier to discipline.
Yeah, right. I mean, what do you think? I mean, I feel strange being, like giving free advice to the repressive apparatus of the state here, but like what you would think that you'd really want is to
shut down Signal.
Is to keep shut down Signal, but like keep the keep Facebook, keep Parler, don't restrict things at all. Just like very quietly arrest people, and make sure it's not publicized. When you do, so nobody stops doing it openly.
Get rid of Signal, get rid of these backdoors, get rid of the dark web if you at all can. And yeah, I mean that's. But I don't know. Again, I'm not sure why I'm giving that
You know,
advice.
giving advice. Yeah, right. But, you know, but that is a much bigger, like, I mean, there is also a whole other thing there, which is on that subject, right, of the repressive apparatus of the state. I mean, I think we agree that, you know, that in some ways it's an extension of the same thing, both because the big tech corporations and the state are very chummy with each other, because the big tech corporations, you know, have a lot of the power over the flow of information that the state would, you know, more than the state in many ways, but also, you know, because the same considerations should be applied in both cases. That, you know, that if like, do you actually want the flow of information to be restricted in this way? And then when you get even beyond the speech issues to the issues about, like, throwing people in jail, then it gets really disturbing, right? Like, I just saw an article the other day in the Nation magazine saying that it's a travesty that, you know, that the Biden administration isn't, like, you know, that it looks like they're not going to throw the book at the Capitol rioters enough, you know, that they need to be doing, like, they need to be applying this, like, felony murder statute that says if you're engaged in a felony and then somebody, you know, in the course of the felony, somebody else who's involved in the felony commits a murder, even if you had nothing to do with it, you know, you could essentially be charged with murder because of the cop, you know, who was beaten to death. And it's, I can't read this thing. Like, is the thought entering you guys' minds at all that, like, this everything that you're advocating would, like, I mean, think about the
how many people would have been arrested on murder charges, say, after the Kyle Rittenhouse murder at the Black Lives Matter protest? I mean, I'm not saying that Rittenhouse was a Black Lives Matter protester, but they were involved in creating a situation where people were killed. Or if you're going to be, you know, not going on a limb like that, there have been shootings of the police that happened, maybe not as a part of the protest, but nonetheless around the same time that Black Lives Matter protests are going on. And if you're going to say that creating the climate of hatred towards the police is a way of participating in the crime of killing a police officer that did happen, then, you know, then you would have a lot of these people who are just peacefully protesting charged with murder. I mean, I may be being a little.
I mean, look, if you're going to say, like, think about the Wisconsin, you know, state house, you know, protests, you know, back in 2011, you know, which is a good case of storming the Capitol. And now, of course, you know, it's not only different in that one had a good cause and the other didn't.
No, they also didn't hit anybody over the head with a fire extinguisher.
Right. That didn't happen either. And of course, it's a very important distinction. But it's a little weird to rest very much on it because like, to rest very much on it in terms of what you think should happen to most people who are involved in storming the Capitol on the 6th, you have to believe that they all understood that stuff like that would be happening. And, you know, that other participants were going to do things like that. And again, it's a really weird standard because, like, if I'm just at I'm thinking back to, like, 2003, you know, a lot of, like, you know, Iraq war protests that I went to, which would be huge protests. And you'd get, like, maybe, like, 50, like, black bloc guys, you know, who might be wanting to do more, you know, confrontational or illegal tactics, you know, and I'm not saying that, you know, any of them beat anybody over the head with a fire, you know, with a fire extinguisher. But it doesn't exactly stretch imagination to imagine, you know, to think that you could have a situation like that where, you know, where one of them, you know, gets into, like, a punching match with a cop, you know, like that's
look, I was at, it wasn't a punching match, but the Infernal Noise Brigade, I think, or at least somebody who was imitating them, you know, used their drums and musical instruments to lead a group of black bloc protesters right up to the police line and then smash through.
Yeah. All right, that's just a small taste of the conversation with Doug Lane about why the left should obviously be opposed to the ramping up of state repression and corporate censorship, which is a sentence that when you say it out loud, it seems so mind-numbingly obvious that it doesn't seem like it should need to be said. But I think that in the sort of disorientation that we've had lately, it kind of does need to be said, right? As that article was printed in the Nation that we're responding to there, that was suggesting the use of the kind of harshest available legal theories to lock up everybody who's storming the Capitol on the 6th, and is obviously disgusting as that event was. I think it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how that could be used against us, or really the word could is almost wrong here, how that will be used against us.
Yeah, I think.
All right. I am now joined, as always, by the great David Griscom, co-host of Left Reckoning, for Outlaws and Revolutionaries. Been a lot going on tonight. I haven't. That's okay though. Give me. All right. There we go.
Man. Well, very glad. I think you're very right to say that there's been a lot going on tonight. So it's very great to be able to kick back a little bit and have a drink. How you doing, Ben?
I have been doing okay. There has been some. Yeah, so it's been a strange night. So Forrest, who would normally be here, has been. I actually finally got back in touch with him over text a few minutes ago, because he was it's just weather conditions were messy with his internet, and then there's been some whatever, like Twitter is as healthy useful a place for
as always, yeah,
as always, right? So there are various senses which a lot's been going on, but what I want to talk about tonight is George Jones.
Oh, yeah, I'm excited for this one, man. I'm going to do my very, very best. I just don't think I'll be able to do George Jones justice. As people who have been listening to these GTAA series, they know that one place I don't like to talk about a lot is Texas.
Yeah, no, like we always try to politely avoid the subject of Texas.
But George Jones is one of the great country music artists of all time. If you're not familiar with him, you need to spend some time, because he really is somebody on a different level than a lot of the other people that we're going to talk about tonight. But he's really special to me in a lot of ways, because in a lot of ways, when you think of the great country music artist, in the great country music singer, is George Jones. And growing up, I used to take these insane rides from Austin, Texas to South Carolina, right? Which meant I went through Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee on the way up there. And George Jones was the soundtrack of all those trips. And even though he's a Texan, I think more and more he's a Southern icon. But more importantly for the show, he's a drunk icon. And we'll get into some of the reasons why going forward. But he is, if you are familiar with George Jones, he is probably one of the greatest country music singers of all times. His voice, the way he sings with such a richness and power that is not matched by many other people, right? So regardless if you like country music or not, he is one of the greatest singers of all time. Man, I'm trying to make a decision here, Ben, and maybe I might need some guidance, because I have some very funny George Jones stories to tell.
Yeah.
But maybe I should dive into a little bit of his music first. What do you think?
Yeah, let's and save the stories for dessert.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go. So he's an East Texas boy, So for people who aren't familiar, like East Texas is where the Southern Pines begin or end, depending on your perspective. Like if you think of the South, of those great forests that sort of like, you know, their expanse is felt throughout Tennessee and South Carolina, North Carolina, etc. They end in Texas and they end in East Texas. And George Jones was very much one of those kind of like country folks who was on the very end of it. So he's the people who was selling moonshine to everybody else, right? Like he's country as country can be, right? And he is probably one of the most influential country singers of all time, just because he has hits from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Like there is no major decade in country music that George Jones was not a participant in. He was a legendary drinker, and we'll get to some of the stories about that later. But you know, some of his great songs is like, man, where do you even start? Tennessee Whiskey is a phenomenal song of his. It's a really phenomenal song. I used to spend my nights in a bar room. Liquor was the only friend I've known. But you rescued me from reaching from the bottom, and you brought me back from being too far gone. Like, you know, real stuff. The King Is Gone is another great drunk person song because he tells a story about how he's sitting at his home. He's like getting really fucked up, and he takes the head off of a Fred Flintstone vitamin gummy jar and fills it up with whiskey. And ends the song with "Yabba Dabba Doo, the king is gone, and so are you." Yeah, exactly. You know, like he has like every good drunk person song that you know in country music. George Jones is probably sang it. That's sort of the way to go with that. And anyways, 40 years of being the king. White Lightning is his most famous song. You know, ooh, White Lightning, right? It's like about moonshine. Like that's his very famous song, but he's done music all the way through. I think the most great drunk song is the one I said a second ago, Tennessee Whiskey or The King Is Gone, are the top two songs. Another good song by him is Who's Gonna Fill Their Shoes, which is a song about, you know, sort of these country artists who are making music past the classics, past the Willie, past the Waylon. Who's going to fill their shoes on the other side of it? Very much a fun song. But I think to really tell people about George Jones, I got to tell some of these stories.
Yeah,
right? Because these are the ones that are really fun. Let's start with love, and we'll move to booze. Because for George, those are very close. But let's start with love. So Tammy Wynette is, if you know George Jones and you're listening to this, you know George Jones, you will recognize that name. If you don't, let me introduce you to her. She was an incredible country music singer from Mississippi, who George loved very, very much, but was not somebody who entered into George's life as an eligible, what's the word for a woman? Bachelor. She did not enter George's life as a suitor, right? So George had to win her over from Don Chappell, who was another country singer and songwriter who was trying to sell songs to George. Anyways, George meets Tammy, loves her from the second he meets her, but he had to deal with the fact that she was married to this guy named Don Chappell. Don Chappell is a real son of a bitch, real asshole, classic fuck kind of drunk ass motherfucker from the South who's just like treats his wife like shit. And anyways, George is spending time with him. He's at dinner one night, and they're all at dinner and they're cooking whatever. And Don decides that that's the night to fucking lay into Tammy. And he's abusing her, yelling at her, or whatever. And George Jones, in his drunken, beautiful, drunken strength and heart, and whatever you want to say for George, flips over the table at this dinner table, like just takes the table, flips over, and he says, "God damn it, Tammy, you love me and I love you. Let's get the fuck out of here." So Tammy leaves Dawn at that moment and then leaves with with George for better for worse, and ends up marrying him about 3 weeks later. I tell that because I have some really good drunk stories about George Jones. So for people who aren't familiar with George, who might not be from the South, George Jones is known as like the OG drunk, the OG drunk husband, for better for worse. And I will just say this. I know a lot of people struggle with booze, and I don't want to make any statements about one thing being funny or whatever, better, whatever. But there are some very funny stories that we could tell from George's drunkenness, and I think they're worth telling. The first one being a few years after he had married Tammy. He had been drinking a little bit too much, and she had hid all the keys to the cars so that he couldn't find himself any more booze. But in George's own words, shining in that beautiful Tennessee sunlight was the keys to our rideable John Deere lawnmower. So anyways, to fast forward there, George very famously rode his John Deere tractor 8 miles from Beaumont, Texas, to the nearest liquor store to buy some booze. And what's very funny about that story is that's not the last time that George Jones had been cut off by his partner and ended up at a drinking establishment driving a John Deere tractor. About 15 years later, he ended up driving a John Deere tractor to at 1 a.m. It was not in the great state of Texas. I believe it was Tennessee. But it was when he's living in Tennessee. He drove his John Deere tractor to a bar. And when his wife finally showed up to pick him up, he looked at the other guys around him. He said, "Boys, I've been telling you she's going to get me sooner or later tonight." Anyways, George is like, for people who are familiar, I don't want them with the wrong impression. Like, he writes, this guy feels, and he writes really amazing songs, but he's just like any one of us, is just like a drunk to the fullest extent. And it's very beautiful to hear these hilarious stories about him. Oh, wait, Ben, I don't want this because I know, I don't know how familiar, you're not very familiar with George Jones, right?
Not that much.
Yeah, George is not somebody who really he doesn't get outside of Dixie in a lot of ways for people. But there's another really great George Jones drunk story that you just have to tell.
Yeah.
And it includes one of our personal favorites, my very much favorite, Waylon Jennings.
Oh, yeah.
And this is a story that has been told by Shooter Jennings, Waylon Jennings' son, which is that this is in Nashville. But George Jones is hanging out drinking all night long with Waylon, getting really fucked up. And he starts getting fucked up, and he starts getting a little wild, as George Jones was known to do with Waylon. And he calls Waylon Jennings something along the lines of like, "You're just a little Conway Twitty singing bastard." So our boy Waylon Jennings does not take very kindly to that.
Sure.
As you can imagine. Ties George Jones up to a tree in his backyard. And George Jones is sitting there tied up to a tree yelling, "I'm the greatest country singer that has ever lived. I'm the greatest country singer that's ever been." And Waylon Jennings says, "That might be true, but you're tied to a goddamn tree right now." And if that kind of insanity and beauty doesn't give you a good sense of why we love these characters, I don't know what will, right? Like that's a good country music story if there's ever been.
Oh, awesome. This is just the perfect way to cap things off.
I'm glad, man.
All right. Thank you so much, brother. See you next week.
Take care. See you soon.
See you. All right. Was the great David Griscom telling us a little bit about George Jones and some amazing stories. And if you, I mean, I understand what he's saying is right. People do struggle a lot, with drinking problems. We don't want to make light of that, but also if you don't like amazing, funny drunk stories, then either you shouldn't listen to this show or you should stop about 3/4 of the way through, since that is definitely part of the Outlaws and Revolutionaries ethos from that segment. But in any case, I am going to probably, since we actually had Forrest again and then we lost him, I think his internet connection went back out. So I would be happy to answer a couple of super chat questions before I go. But other than that, I think that we probably want to cut it a little bit earlier than usual tonight. So I would say that yeah, I think that's good. It's probably good to cut it a little bit early tonight. There was a ridiculous 5-hour stream last night, so could make this episode not exactly short and sweet. We've already gone an hour and 40 minutes. I think this is a pretty reasonable length for an episode, but shorter than we have been lately, at least. But first, I want to just talk again about a little bit of the stuff that's I'm sorry, Andy, we're not going to do another 5 hours tonight. That's really not sustainable. But hold on.
Hey, how's it going?
It is pretty good. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. It's snowing really, really hard here.
Yeah, I was a little so earlier on when your internet was out, earlier, and so I couldn't get in touch with you. And then, Krystal had messaged me earlier today to talk about how bad the snow was, and then when she, there were a few minutes of us having problems connecting, which was 100% my fault. I'd actually sent her the wrong link, it turned out, but. Yeah. But then, like, when she wasn't coming on at first, I was like, oh shit, the blizzard has just knocked out everybody's internet. No Forrest, no Krystal. This is just going to be like me talking at the camera. I don't know how long I can sustain this, even with clips. But I do actually, now that you're here, though, before we answer some last minute chat questions and we wrap up the stream for tonight, I do want to go back to a couple of our Biden clips that we did not get a chance to get to in our time with Krystal, because you really assembled some amazing clips for this, and I want people to just to get a little bit more of a sense of the breadth of who and what Joe Biden is. I want to show a couple more of these. So let's do the crime bill.
Here, do you put it on your end, or?
Oh, I can do it on my end. Yeah, that's fine. All right, probably easier right now. Let's just do that. Here we go. So let's do. Here we go.
Since 1986, Congress has passed over 230 new or expanded penalties for drug and criminal offenses in this United States. 230 new penalties. And these penalties range from an automatic 5 years in jail for any person caught with a rock of crack cocaine, a piece of crack cocaine as small as a quarter. I don't have a quarter with me, but if you visualize what one looks like, yeah, I do have a quarter. If you have a piece of crack cocaine no bigger than this quarter that I'm holding in my hand, 1/4 of $1, we passed a law through the leadership of Senator Thurmond and myself and others, a law that says if you're caught with that, you go to jail for 5 years. You get no probation. You get
Nothing other than 5 years in jail. Judge doesn't have a choice. Now, the fact of the matter is, we've gone from there all the way up to saying, under the leadership of Senator Thurmond, and I'd like to suggest that I take some small credit for it myself as well, and others, the presiding officer, that there is now a death penalty. And we passed it a couple years ago. If you are a major drug dealer involved in the trafficking of drugs and murder results in your activities, you go to death. And a number of other severe penalties. We changed the law so that if you are arrested and you are a drug dealer, under our forfeiture statutes, the government can take everything you own, everything from your car to your house, your bank account, not merely what they confiscate in terms of the dollars from the transaction that you just got caught engaging in. They can take everything. We have laws in the last several years where we don't allow judges discretion to sentence people. Flat time sentencing. You get caught, you go to jail. Well, all of these tools have been at the president's disposal for the last 100 weeks and more. Now, if America's crime problem is worse than it ever was, it's not because the Congress has failed to give the president the tools. It's done its part, but rather because the administration has failed to use the power given to it by the Congress over the last 5 years, and in particular the last 100 weeks, to bring this epidemic under control. Specifically, the administration's record of inaction includes some glaring examples. Now, if you wonder why I'm so frustrated, Mr. President, I've been dealing with this issue, crime. I have been either the sponsor or co-sponsor of every major tough piece of legislation relating to dealing with the criminal element in this country in the last 10 years, as many others have. And I hear the president tell me I'm not tough on crime. So I hope this crime bill, when it passes, the Biden-Hatch crime bill, as it becomes law, God willing, I hope that we will have ended once and for all this notion that is a hangover from the 60s, that somehow Democrats are weak on crime and Democratic presidents are weak on crime and Republicans are tough on crime. The truth is, every major crime bill since 1976 that's come out of this Congress, every minor crime bill has had the name of the Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, Joe Biden, on that bill, and has had a majority vote of the Democratic members of the United States Senate on the bill. So one of the things I want to do in addition to end the crime is end the political carnage that goes on when we talk about crime. Crime is not Democrat or Republican. Making the streets safe is not a Democratic or Republican issue. This is one of those issues I hope this passage of this bill will be taken out of the gridlock category and moved into an emerging consensus. And the consensus is as follows, and I will cease when I finish this statement. The consensus is, A, we must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street. That's number one. There's a consensus on that. There's a second thing that we all have agreed upon, and that is unless we do something, Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. I'm the guy that said
Rehabilitation, when it occurs, we don't understand it, notice it. And when we notice it and we know it occurs, we don't know why. So you cannot make rehabilitation a condition for release. That's why in our system, there's the federal system, you serve 85% of your time. I remember when it was going on, when I was making these arguments in the late 70s, they used to call it Biden's same time for the same crime provision.
Another thing about how perspectives change over time. Bobby Rush, member of Congress, said the other day, "I'm ashamed that I voted for the 94 crime bill." You ashamed of that bill?
Not at all. And in fact, I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
And by the way, we talk about this mostly in terms of Black Lives Matter. Black lives really do matter. But the problem is institutional racism in America. That's the overarching problem that still exists. And we should be talking about it. And you look at it, the legacy of racism in housing and jobs and so on. So, but having said that, if you take a look at the crime bill, of the money in the crime bill, the vast majority went to reducing sentences, diverting people from going to jail for drug offenses into what I came up with, the drug courts, providing for boot camps instead of sending people to prison so you didn't relearn whatever the bad thing that got you there in the first place. Put 100,000 cops in the street.
Meantime, an awful lot of people were jailed for minor drug crimes after the
Exactly
crime.
right.
Was it a mistake to support it?
Yes, it was. But here's where the mistake came. The mistake came in terms of what the states did locally. What we did federally, we said it was, and you remember, George, it was all about the same time for the same crime. What I had done as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, took the 10 circuit courts of appeals, took some really brilliant lawyers working for me in judiciary. We did a study. And we determined what happens if, for the first, second, third offense, for any crime in the criminal justice system, at the federal level, if you're a black man, it's the first time you committed robbery. How long would you go to jail on average? If you're a white man, how long? Black man would go to jail on average 13 years. White man, 2 years. I go down the list of every single crime. So we set up a sentencing commission. We didn't set the time. Every single solitary maximum was reduced in there. But what happened was it became the same time for the same crime. So it said you have to serve between 1 and 3 years. It ended up becoming much lower. Black folks went to jail a lot less than they would have before, but it was a mistake. And secondly, we're in a situation here where the federal prison system was reduced by 38,000 people under our administration. And one of these things we should be doing, there should be no minimum mandatories in the law. That's why I'm offering $20 billion to states to change their state laws to eliminate minimum mandatories and set up drug courts. No one should be going to jail because they have a drug problem. They should be going to rehabilitation, not to jail. We should fundamentally change the system, and that's what I'm going to do.
But why didn't he do it 4 years ago?
Look, Forrest, it could be my uncle, your cousin, my grandma, your sister,
my daughter, your neighbor, and any of them.
Yeah. Any combination it could be. Yeah. No, that is remarkable. Leading up to the former president asking a very good question there at the end. But I think my favorite part of that whole thing, I mean, obviously, in all the early clips, Biden is bragging about how draconian the crime bill is, how they're just throwing people in jail and locking away, locking them up and throwing away the key. How this is, you have these great mandatory minimums for everything. The judge doesn't get to let people off easy. And then later on, somehow he's retconned the crime bill into actually being about more lenient sentences.
Yeah.
But my favorite part of that whole sequence is when he is there's a point at the end there where he's almost giving this woke justification.
Yeah. And he's like, no, it's like almost like the Tarantino revenge porn answer. He's like, well, before that, white people would get so much less time and black people would get all this time. And now they get the same time for the same crime. We're just putting more people away,
Yeah, right. No, exactly. Which actually kind of goes back to the preview played earlier of conversation with Doug Lane. Because it's the same thinking that like, oh, all right, so there's outrageous double standards, and the way to solve those double standards is by beefing up the state to crack down more harshly on everybody.
Yeah.
Be like if the triumphant conclusion of the Civil Rights Act was making everybody go to the substandard schools that Black people had to go to,
or the Voting Rights Act. Nobody votes from now on. Nobody. Look, Black people can't vote. White people couldn't vote. Now nobody votes.
That's right.
We've made it more equal.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the first thing we ever watched in the Sunday night debate series was William F. Buckley's debate about civil rights with James Baldwin, and there's a point in that they're at like Oxford or something, and there's a point where somebody where he's sort of doing the conservative, like these are so deeply ingrained problems, what can you possibly do about them with the government? And somebody in the audience yells out, "Oh, you should let them vote," in Mississippi, and he says that he does this in this very like dry wit William F. Buckley kind of way. But I think it's his real opinion coming out. He says, well, if I had my way, most white people in Mississippi wouldn't be able to vote either.
Yeah, I remember that quote, and it's like just the elitism dripping off William F. Buckley's lips on that.
Dude, don't worry. I hate the poor white people also.
I mean, I don't know. The first couple clips where he's talking about like Mr. President, like those are before the crime bill. Those are when him and Strom Thurmond were working on all the laws to give George H.W. Bush more power to crack down on nonviolent offenders and violent offenders throughout the country. And he's working with segregationists. He's openly praising Strom Thurmond as someone who's helped him with all these bills. And he's saying, why haven't you used the death penalty on more people? Congress has given you all this power. So I guess George H.W. Bush should blame Congress for not giving him the power to execute more people during the moral panic of 91. And he's saying, well, Congress is giving you the power to execute anyone you want. Why haven't you used it? Why haven't you killed more nonviolent drug offenders and put them away? Why haven't you killed more, executed more drug kingpins? Like, we've given you all these powers, and you've chosen only to execute one person. Are you saying there's only one person who's capable of being executed right now?
Yeah, my son Hunter knows at least 5 of these guys. Yeah, it's not a. I don't know. I actually kind of like I actually kind of enjoy Hunter as like a movie character, but
but there is this deep hypocrisy of Hunter being addicted to crack of all things, and then and then Biden having pushed these draconian laws specifically for crack dealers.
Yeah, and it's not, of course, that that means that he shouldn't be compassionate about his son. Obviously, it's good that he's compassionate to his son. He'd be definitely a slightly worse human if he wasn't. It's that it's like there's a, not to be too cheesy about this, but like there's this old Arthur Miller play called All My Sons, where the whole point, the big conclusion at the end, it's about somebody who I'm going to spoil this 60-year-old stage play. The big conclusion at the end, the guy in the play was convicted during World War II of selling faulty equipment to the Army and the Air Force, I guess. And this big thing about how they're trying to figure out whether his own son might have died as a result of some of the faulty equipment that he sold to the military, and then he's reassured because they don't. And then somebody dresses them down. It's like they should all be your sons, right? But without quite going there, it's like, yeah, no, it's nice that he had compassion for Hunter, but it's a problem that he didn't have compassion for the numerous, much less well-connected people who were addicted to the same drug, who were out of economic desperation were selling the same drug. And
then he says, in that first clip, he's like, there are predators on the streets and we need to put them all away. And then he's like, and rehabilitation doesn't work. That's what I figured out. We don't know why people get rehabilitated. And then in that last clip, he's like, we need to rehabilitate some of these people and, make sure they don't do the crimes that they committed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think a big part of it with Biden specifically is he took a bet on, the future being far more reactionary than it was. So he jumps on all these crime bills because it seems like in the 90s the future is going to be far more reactionary, and that's how the Democrats stay in power. And at this point, people have gotten a lot more, I think, empathetic towards drug use specifically, and Biden's kind of had to do a whole 360 on that, or 180 on that. But like, it's interesting because I think that that's where he put his chips in that on that spot.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it, and I mean, I'm normally not somebody who likes to put too much emphasis on this because I think if this is like your entire explanation of something like this, you'll often end up missing a lot. Like, I don't think that mass incarceration is just a product of racism. I think that like the sort of analysis you get from people like Cedric Johnson that actually like that big turn towards mass incarceration in the 1970s is part of it is because of an actual crime wave. That's true, that happened, but like the big calculation that was made was that you could respond to this by expanding the Great Society, expanding the welfare state, like trying to really attack poverty much more directly. But that would be both politically and literally more expensive than just ramping up like a much harsher regime of policing and incarceration. So that's kind of what the bipartisan establishment went with instead. Like, I think that is like the big story as far as the history of mass incarceration. But also when it comes to what you're talking about, the drug thing, I kind of think that really is just racism, because in that period when Biden is doing all that, demagoguing about the, holding up the quarter and talking about how, the tiniest little amount of crack, is going to under his bill is going to lead to you being locked up forever and the dealer can be executed and all this crazy shit like that. Even if it was inaccurate, it was widely seen as a pathology of Black people. Whereas I think with the opioid epidemic, I think a lot of people are a lot more aware of a lot more white people who have these problems, and that itself leads to a lot more empathy.
I mean, he very specifically talks about crack cocaine users. Like, he tries to make sure that we know that that's the group of people he's talking about. And, predators are also a pretty racist code word. I mean, you saw Hillary Clinton use it at one point with super predators. So I think that he's very specifically signaling to a racial group of people. But
when he says, I don't care what caused it, right? I don't care what the causes are of crime. It doesn't matter how you got that way. If you're attacking, my sister, my uncle, my brother, whatever, like, he's not talking to an audience who he thinks is going to, like, he's talking to an audience that doesn't think that he's talking about anybody they know. I mean, that's what it gets down to.
Mm-hmm. And I know, I think, I mean, there's a big part of it where also, they got the all of the Black leaders, which is what Biden points out, like all the Black mayors and governors and everybody in Congress to vote for this crime bill. Like, it was like pretty much everybody voted for the crime bill at the time because it was during this huge moral panic about crime and this huge reactionary backlash. And Biden was definitely leading the way on making it pretty much impossible for people not to vote for it. Like, one thing was the Violence Against Women Act attached to the crime bill, so that if you didn't vote for it, they could be like, oh well, obviously they don't care about women who have been beat up in domestic abuse situations.
Right. Yeah, right. I mean, which is something they did. Like, they tied the Violence Against Women Act to it specifically to make it harder for liberals to vote against it.
Yeah.
Which
I just my final thought on it, I guess. Sorry, because this was something that you said, kind of with him talking about, liberals kind of care about where people come from and like the situations that led up to it and the socioeconomic situation. And I think that there's just this terror for people like Biden and for Bill Clinton in the 90s that Democrats have to move away from these liberal notions because in their mind it's not working. There's still a crime wave, and Democrats are just going to be punished for seeming too liberal, for seeming to care too much. So the new Democrats have to show that we're Democrats, but we're tough. We're tough on crime. We're willing to execute like a mentally handicapped man right before the show that, like, you know, we're that tough. Like, there's a speech that he gives about the crime bill, and some of it was in there. But at one point he says, Bill Clinton believes in the death penalty. He believes in execution. And, you know, all you can think about is
Willie Ray Rector.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, yeah, by the way, if people read Christopher Hitchens' book about the Clintons, No One Left to Lie To, the part about Willie Ray Rector in there is just savage. Like that really is, you know, one of, like, maybe the most disgusting thing that anybody's ever done during a presidential campaign. You know, Clinton flying to Arkansas to personally oversee the execution of a mentally handicapped, you know, black man, just to prove, you know, how tough on crime he was. But also, you know, linking up to the other half of that calculation that we're talking about, that like a big part of why there was this turn towards mass incarceration was that it was intimately tied to the turn against further expansions of the welfare state and the war on poverty and all that stuff, which does bring us to maybe, yeah, I think maybe the last you know, Biden clips that we'll be doing tonight, because they are just amazing.
I mean, whatever happened to old conservative discipline about paying for what you spend? I'm up for re-election this year, and I'm going to remind everybody what I did at home, which is going to cost me politically. When I argued that we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well. I meant Medicare and Medicaid. I meant veterans benefits. I meant every single solitary thing in the government. And I not only tried it once, I tried it twice, I tried it a third time, and I tried it a fourth time. Somebody has to tell me in here how we're going to do this hard work without dealing with any of those sacred cows.
The balanced budget amendment approach being brought forth by the Republican majority within the context of asking, as I understand it, for a $60 billion increase in military spending and major tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country, leads all serious economists to the conclusion that the balanced budget amendment will be a disaster for working people, for elderly people, for low-income people. It will mean, in my view, the destruction of the Social Security system as we know it. It will mean savage cuts in Medicare, in Medicaid, in the opportunity of young people to get grants and loans to go to college. It will mean major cutbacks in nutrition programs for hungry children. It will tamper with the unemployment compensation program, as we heard earlier. It will be a disaster for the vast majority of the people in this country. The economy is not booming. The standard of living of middle America and working people is in decline. Unemployment is far higher than the official statistics indicate. It seems to us to be very foolhardy to take away an option of the federal government that we may wish to use, which says that when our physical and human infrastructure is in collapse, when our mass transportation system is in so much need, when our roads are falling apart, when our bridges are collapsing, that it does not make sense to take away the option that the United States Congress may wish to use, and which the Progressive Caucus believes is necessary to rebuild the physical and human infrastructure of America.
I think Bernie is on the right side of history as far as like the long-term strategy, but it is crazy that it feels like when the New Democrats got elected in the 90s, Biden was kind of leading the charge on a very different type of strategy. You know, after the Great Society, after the New Deal, that turn that started the Carter administration towards like a more centrist. You know, that is when Biden got elected, and he was part of the group of people pushing Carter to the right in the 70s on economic policy. And he was part of the, you know, he pushed Reagan to the right. There's a Ryan Grimm article about it, how he pushed Reagan to the right on drug policy when Reagan was interested in completely uninterested in going after drug offenders at the time. And he pushed Bush to the right on police spending and on kind of the same thing. So
yeah, which I actually, even though I said that was the last one, I think maybe we should watch just that, because I think that has to be seen to be believed.
Is from Senator Joseph Biden of Delaware. He's addressing the nation from his office on Capitol Hill.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a job to do. We all have a job to do. We speak with great concern about the drug problem in America today, but we fail to appreciate or address it for what it really is, the number one threat to our national security. It affects the readiness of our Army, the productivity of our workers, and the achievement of our students, and the very health and safety of our families. America is under attack, literally under attack by an enemy who is well-financed, well-supplied, and well-armed, and fully capable of declaring total war against the nation and its people, as we've seen in Colombia. Here in America, the enemy is already ashore. And for the first time, we are fighting and losing a war on our own soil. Every president for the past 2 decades, Democrat and Republican alike, has declared war on drugs. And each of them has lost that war and lost it miserably. They lost because they attempted to deal with only part of the drug problem. They lost because their initiatives were pulled apart by bureaucratic squabbling among their advisors. They lost because they always did too little and they did it too late. That's why the Democrats and Republicans in the Congress got together last year to write the law that required the president to give us a national drug strategy. The one you heard tonight, you heard him deliver it. We don't oppose the president's plan. All we want to do is strengthen it.
And then he goes on to talk about how he wants to strengthen President George H.W. Bush's plan because it wasn't harsh enough.
There's one part of it where he talks about cops in the streets, and he's like, oh, he doesn't want all the cops on the streets that we want, which really, I mean, is the problem with like why we need to do things like defund the police right now, or why they're pushing for things like defund the police, because the police budgets are the one things that can't be cut in every city. You know what I mean? Like they keep expanding, just like the military budget, and the federal money towards police every time something happens in the city, the federal money towards police gets bigger, and all these programs that they let police into, the Army surplus programs where cities can just buy military surplus gear to give to their city police station. Like it becomes kind of, as Biden kind of called the sacred cow of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Now the sacred cow is military budget, police budget.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And I think that it's something that, like, on the one hand, we don't want to exaggerate the point, because I think sometimes when people talk about, defunding the police, they make it sound like this would be enough. Like if we just defund the police, then we can have all these other great city services and have, like counselors, social workers we can call instead of the police as the first responders, and, better like, compassionate drug programs and beef up education. And the thing is, even though I do support, like, to the extent that what people mean by defund the police is that, like, your local police, if your local police department has an equipment budget big enough, they could buy a tank. Right. Like clearly.
Yeah. And there's small cities with the tank budget.
No, which is insane. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, but I think we also need to be careful about this, because when people talk that way, as if like all it is a matter of shifting money around within like local budgets, that like we can just, take enough money away from the police and then we'll have enough money for all those other great things that I just listed off. Like the math doesn't really work for that. That like if you, I think like I think you could do like something like take away like 75% of the budget of the NYPD, which is one of the most absurdly overfunded police departments in the world, and that still wouldn't even equalize the spending levels between the poorest and the richest districts within New York City. All of which is just to say that you can't like defund your way to local social democracy. You also do need to raise taxes on rich people.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's still, I think that that the resistance to doing that, like to saying, okay, can we take away the tank budget and put it to better uses, and that won't generate that much money by itself, but what the hell, it's a start, is significant. And this is also important to talk about because like the Biden people saying that like Krystal Ball was talking about earlier, those Georgia elections, that you can't like, oh, let's just not talk about policing at all, right? So we don't rock the boat is significant. And it goes to one of the reasons that we're doing all this, right? Like why we're playing all these clips, because I know that like some people, will watch this, or I don't know, maybe people who are pissed off by it won't get this far in the episode. But some people, will watch it, since I know there are people who like the show who aren't necessarily as politically hardcore, but maybe they like, some of the logic and philosophy stuff. Maybe they like other aspects. And they're basically progressive people, but they're not, but they think, they might think, hey, I don't think this is most viewers, by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's some, right? Who might say, hey, come on, the guy's been president for like less than 2 weeks. What are you guys doing? Right? Like give him a chance, see what happens.
I had multiple people like comment that pretty much on a Facebook post, just saying that I was going into this deep dive and finding these clips and like cutting up those kind of clip montages. And I had multiple people be like, well, give the guy a chance. And I'm like, well, what are we going to do for Monday content then? Like, Jesus.
Yeah, come on. But also, I mean, on a bigger level than that, I think the reason to talk about the fact that he has decades of bragging about civil asset forfeiture and mandatory minimums, of talking about how various Republican presidents weren't doing enough to lock up poor people, for drug offenses, that he has this long record of talking about Social Security and, Medicare, cuts, all of that stuff. The reason is that it's just wrong to pretend that he's coming on, see Jason Miles, who's actually going to be a guest next week, just came on the chat. I think he heard that last part and said, you guys must be talking about Joe Biden. The reason that it's important to bring all that stuff up is that he's not coming in as a blank slate. It's not like, oh, we just have no idea what he's going to do. And like, it's like the way people talk about this is almost like we just held a lottery, to decide, like everybody drew lots and then we randomly made somebody president and we just have no idea what their politics are. We have no idea what the background is. Like, this is all relevant information about the guy who just became the most powerful person in the world.
Well, the other thing is that he's basically, he spent his time, at least towards the end of it, maybe not in the beginning, he's running on kind of destroying a lot of the policies that he kept, like that he built. You know what I mean? Like the most reactionary parts of our criminal justice law, as he said, I'm the guy, like, he made it very clear. I'm the guy who set most of that up. So he's coming in saying he's going to slowly, take down like the 90s tough on crime consensus. He's going to take down things like mandatory minimums. He's going to take down, like the most extravagant, I guess, parts of, what we allow the cops to do. And that's what he ran on. So it's very relevant because if he's claiming that he's going to be the person who takes all of that down and he's the person who put it up in the first place, we should know exactly what he's talking about.
That's right. And the fact that he put it all up in the first place is relevant to how seriously we take it when he says that he's going to take it all down. Because look, maybe some of that stuff, like he maybe he does kind of believe it when he says that he's going to take it all down now. It's what we were talking about with Krystal earlier, just the opportunist interpretation of Biden, which I'm sure is true on at least some issues, that he just doesn't really care that way much one way or the other. Like you said, he's just going to make his bet, about where the future is going to lie. But what we know, the fact that we know that that's the best case scenario. And by the way, I keep forgetting to mention but everything that we've been talking about is in a book by our comrade, my Jacobin, coworker, and a repeat past guest, Branko Marketic, who is it's called Yesterday's Man, the Case Against Joe Biden. You can from Verso Books. You can buy it from Red Emma's, which is the link that you see there. So that's a worker-owned bookstore in Baltimore. So that's redemmas.org. But the reason that this history, everything that Branko talks about in that book, is relevant, is that the best case interpretation is that he's just a hack. That's, the worst case interpretation is it really was important to him to engage in mass incarceration and to cut Medicare and all the rest of these things, which would be horrifying. The best interpretation, and I'm sure there are elements of truth to both interpretations on different issues, but the best interpretation
you just froze. I think you just froze for a minute there.
Okay. Yeah. So I was going to say, the worst case interpretation is that he really was passionate about mass incarceration and budget cuts and everything else, which would be horrifying. The best interpretation is that he's just a spineless hack who doesn't care one way or the other. And I'm sure there are elements of truth to both interpretations on different issues, to different combinations, different times. But whatever's true about that, the fact that he did all this means that at the very goddamn least, we could say he is not going to be passionately pursuing undoing all of it, because at the very least, we know that he's not deeply committed to the opposite of all this stuff because he spent his career doing it.
Yeah. Well, I think what I came to the conclusion of after watching all of those clips, after seeing, watching some of his Senate Judiciary hearings and stuff, I think he took a bet that the future was going to be more reactionary, because between the 70s and the 90s, things got incredibly reactionary towards liberal policies that have been put in place kind of to protect people's rights that were accused of a crime, or to help poor people kind of get out of that situation, to help poor Black people get out of poverty. And the backlash to that was kind of what Biden rose with his his anti-busing talk. Like, that's kind of what Biden rode into power. So as things got increasingly more reactionary, his bet was that things were going to get further more reactionary, and that there was going to be a constant backlash against liberals at that point. So he kind of says it, and he's desperate to put his name on the crime bill. He's desperate to put his name on everything, so that when Democrats get pushed out of power by more reactionary Republicans, he's one of the ones that stays in power. So I just think he's kind of like a reactionary Forrest Gump. Like,
yeah, speaking of which, this was just a minute.
Right after 1994, and you can ask the Attorney General this, because I got a call when he introduced the Patriot Act. He said, Joe, I'm introducing the act basically as you wrote it in 1994. It was defeated then, not by any liberals. It was defeated then by the folks who worried that we'd have the Minutemen would get in trouble, by the Mr. Barrs of the world, who were worried about the right wing, not anything else. So that has nothing to do with you all, but just to set the record straight. Almost the same thing that got passed, the Patriot Act, was introduced by me in 1994, and it was the right wing that defeated it. You guys tried to help get it passed, including the wiretap changes and the rest. So
good, because we have a vote on it. I wouldn't
Yeah, our graphic designer Jander World sent me that too. Had to throw that into the mix. But yeah, look, if nothing else, like the fact that this super cynical interpretation you're laying out is the best case interpretation. I mean, you could try to say there's a better case that like he had these like genuine changes of heart, but what I want to know is if he did, when when did that happen, right? Like, surely if he had like some sort of road to Damascus moment where he realized that he has been helping to bolster a deeply unjust society for decades. That must have happened at some point after 2019 when he told a room full of donors that nothing would fundamentally change if he became president. It must have happened after those clips that we watched earlier with Krystal, where he's making all kinds of incredibly disingenuous arguments against Medicare for all. And if he had this incredible change of heart, you would think that he wouldn't be lying about what was in the crime bill and or at the very least presenting it in a way that's almost the polar opposite of the way that he was presenting it in those clips in the 90s. And because he's not a blank slate, and we don't normally treat normally when a new president comes to office, we treat their record before becoming president as if it's pretty relevant. I mean,
Yeah.
In late November 2016, I was marching. I was doing I was participating in an anti-Trump march in New Jersey. Nobody was going to wait to see and give him a chance, nor should they have. And to my mind, look, if Biden decides that he's going to have that road to Damascus moment now, which, and by the way, if he was going to, I think Krystal had some really useful concrete suggestions earlier for how he could show it, right? Like he could take up Bernie Sanders' proposal to temporarily give everybody in the country eligibility for Medicare as a pandemic emergency measure, and that wouldn't even commit him to reversing himself on the Medicare for all stuff. Although good luck taking it away once people are used to having it. But he could champion that, and Joe Manchin. But like we were saying earlier, he could, he could fly down to West Virginia and clasp the hand of some primary challenger and say, hey, Joe Manchin is the one person in the country who's standing in between you guys and having health care.
Hey man, I just learned something from the last few months. People really don't like their private insurance. Who would have known? Come on, man. Let's.
Yeah. He could. He won't, right? But he could. And I guess to my mind, the important reason to point that out is not because I believe that the left certainly could do that much to pressure him, right? Like there might be individual votes where leftists in Congress can strategically say play hardball and say they're not going to vote for this or that if it doesn't include such and such amendment or whatever. That might be effective in certain cases, but generally speaking, it's not that I think that there's much that the left could do to pressure him. I think that what we're going to get is pretty much what we're going to get.
Yeah. I think the only thing that you can really do to pressure Joe Biden, and he said it within his crime bill speech, is you change the political consensus completely, which is not going to happen in 4 years. But if you change the political consensus to the point where there's literal political backlash for supporting, private insurance, then I think Joe Biden would change his mind instantaneously. But since that's not the case, and incumbents don't get punished for not supporting Medicare for all, and we're not on the point where a lot of leftists even vote that way. They vote for the lesser of two evils. I don't think that there's a way to change his mind, and I definitely don't think there's a way to change his mind within 4 years. But
no, but though you can't, even though you're most I don't think you're going to change his mind. I think he is pretty much going to be where he's going to be, right? I mean, I said this during the election that I thought that it made sense, if you're in a swing state, to hold your nose and do what you got to do, because I think there are good reasons to prefer fighting with terrible corporate centrist Democrats rather than right-wing Republicans. That there are things in terms of court appointments, in terms of the National Labor Relations Board, in terms of a lot of things that do make a difference there, both in terms of harm reduction and strategically. But I also said I don't particularly think that you're going to be able to change him. I think Biden is what you're going to get. But the reason to point this stuff out is not because we're gonna the American left is going to get it together so much that we're going to like have some super effective, super fast pressure campaign. The reason to point all this stuff out is because we need to be, I think every day we need to be pointing out, hey, here's what Biden could be doing if he wanted to. Here's the gap between what he could be doing and what he is doing. Even with Joe Manchin, even with whatever, here's the thing he could do. Here's the thing he could do. And the reason to point that out is precisely because Biden probably can't be changed. And so what we ultimately need to do is not like somehow convince centrists to become good social democrats. What we need to do is to just beat them in a whole bunch of elections, which is obviously a very big task. It's a very steep, uphill battle. But I think that's the only way to do it, right? So so anytime we can point out, hey, here's a shitty, awful thing that centrists are doing to screw us over, that makes it a little bit easier to launch these primary campaigns.
Yeah. And to convince people that, some of these things really are possible in the right political conditions. But I think there's a really telling moment in the crime bill montage where specifically, Biden's saying, I don't want to end, the big part of what I want to do with this bill is to end the political consequences for coming out being tough on crime. So he's leading the way for somebody like Bill Clinton because the big thing in his mind is, I don't want political backlash from liberals for taking these positions. So if every centrist Democrat has these same tough on crime positions and we acknowledge that there's a political consensus, then the backlash that I get from the left isn't going to be a real thing. So I think he really does think in these terms, with consensus and with, what the establishment position is doing. And he's constantly triangulating. And in that sense, his 20 years in power is really queuing up Bill Clinton's existence more than anything else.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And it really is remarkable if you go back and look at obviously the so-called New Democrats, which Biden was very much a part of. The Clintons were obviously at the center of that group. And that neoliberal turn in the Democratic Party that started with Carter and kind of culminated with Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama in most ways represented a continuation of it. But the Clinton era was really the high water mark. That's where they did the crime bill. That's when they when they did welfare reform. And as much as the New Democrats were really cynical political operators, and obviously somebody like Bill Clinton, was, within those confines. It's certainly morally despicable, and not politically aligned with what we want. But, we're very smart political operators in a lot of ways. There's also this element of just incredible delusion that, I think the Clintonites really believed in the 90s that if they did welfare reform in the crime bill, that would just take away crime and welfare as issues that Republicans could use against them forever.
Yeah. And just, taking all these issues off the table that we're seen as more liberal, I think that the Rick Perlstein books are a really interesting study into that. The reactionary backlashes that occurred at that time period pretty often to different policies that had been kind of Democratic consensus for a long time. So I think that these are really, consensus operators, and it's kind of been the most toxic part of our politics, is that as they build these different, as they build what they consider a consensus, it's always against poor people. It's always a backlash against poor people, either getting too much from the welfare state or, poor Black people and putting away people for way too long over drug crimes because there were some people in the news that then were, there definitely was a crime wave, but then it's a backlash against everybody that they now consider a criminal, and everybody, it's these different things that they want to show. It happened with the New Democrat or the new Labor in the UK too. these consensus operating, more right wing, like center left, what was considered a center left party operators, and it all happened around the same time.
Yeah, no, for sure. All right, so I want to. So there's a super chat question. Yoda 7104. Think there's a better chance of collapse in the GOP or taking over the Dems. Think third party is viable in our system. Long-term strategic thoughts. I definitely have some thoughts about that. But you want to take first crack at it?
I mean, I just think a third party that emerges is probably going to end up just pushed back into the two-party system. You know what I mean? Like, I think that there is somewhat. It's hard. It's hard to really make that assessment because it seemed like for a while there, like AOC and Bernie and all, like it was all kind of signs that maybe eventually we could take over the Democratic Party. But with Joe Biden getting elected and centrists kind of pushing back into that, it doesn't really seem like it's a possible thing now. So I don't know. I mean, I do think that there's a chance to at a local and state level build a third party that really works in terms of like the populist movement, and that can have real strategic victories, and that can really push everybody else left. Because at that point there's big victories within state and local governments, and there is shown that pressures like existing parties to have to triangulate to that. So I think that's the first step, is to build maybe a third party in some of these state and local elections that really can have some success. Because at a national level, I don't think you can just pop up and say, like, we're a third party and we're here to take over the independence of both parties. I'd love if that worked, but there's no historical, terms that seems to have worked in.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I definitely agree with the last part of what you said. I think that the idea that you're going to build, especially on the national level, although frankly, even on the state level, I'm not very optimistic. I mean, I think that like in places like New York where you have fusion voting, so you can have like the working families party, stuff like that. Obviously that's different. But as far as like real third parties on even on the state level, I mean, once you get down to the local level, cities, a lot of those elections are nonpartisan anyway, so that's just a different thing. And if there's anywhere that you can do a ballot line third party, maybe it'd be for partisan local elections. But it's very, I mean, obviously the American electoral system is really, really good at stopping people from creating electorally viable third parties. You have to, every once in a while, something will happen on a state level. People will be elected as third party candidates or independents like Jesse Ventura or Bernie Sanders. Although like the Bernie example is interesting, right? Because Ventura wasn't in for very long at all. And in Bernie's case, obviously he managed to stick that out for the long haul, but that was by essentially becoming a quasi-Democrat, that he caucused with the Democrats in the Senate. And then they just stopped, like after the first couple times, like they just stopped running candidates against him, like essentially, even though he wasn't elected on the Democratic Party ballot line, he was essentially elected as a Democrat, for all practical purposes.
And that can go the other way too, because the only other independent in the Senate is Angus King from Maine, and he's kind of kept his position in power by acting as a wedge between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and just being a Democrat that occasionally like someone that votes for the Democrats most of the time, but if he thinks the Democrats have gone too far left, voting with the Republicans, and that's how he's kind of kept his wedge in power. So just because somebody is independent doesn't mean that.
That they're actually independent, right? There are lots of there's independent and there's independent. So I guess just to wrap up the third party question, I think it's very hard for even people who've won, state level positions, or they've won in a state, they've won a Senate seat, for a state, that it's very hard for them to stay meaningfully independent of the two-party system, even when lightning strikes like that. And so I guess all of which is not necessarily to say that I think it's impossible that we could ever have a viable new party. I just think that you have to, when you're thinking about this stuff, I mean, this sounds like a really basic thing to say, I know, but like you just have to think about American history, not the history of other countries. And that's not because there's anything like super special about America. That's just because our electoral system is very different from most of the other countries where people can point to the emergence of viable third parties, and especially, you were talking about the populace earlier, but I mean that was like the 1890s, and it was reabsorbed into the Democratic Party, and the system has changed a lot since the 1890s. A lot of the elements were in place, but like a lot of the laws that make it really hard to have third parties, have shifted since then. So all of which is just to say, I think that it's possible that we could get a new major party in the American system, but I don't think it would happen the way that third party advocates usually think it would happen. I don't think it could happen like, Jill Stein getting, 1% of the vote turns into, I don't know. I mean, Howie Hawkins actually got like way less than Jill Stein, but Howie Hawkins getting 2% of the vote or whatever turns into, and then in like 50 years, people are actually winning elections. I don't think it could happen that way. I think you have to look at the only time that there actually has been a new major party that has been, has replaced one of the existing parties within the American system, which was Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party in the 19th century. It was as an anti-slavery third party, then became one of the two major parties. And that didn't happen through some fringe candidate getting a couple percent of the vote and that somehow snowballing into something later. That happened because one of the existing parties basically ruptured apart, and the anti-slavery wing of the Whigs became the Republicans. And so if we got a new major party in the US, I think it would be like that. All of which is just to say that I think the only path forward is building up like the Bernie crack kind of wing of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think like Dustin Guastella and Jared Abbott, I remember had an article in Jacobin about this, that they say, look, taking over the Democratic Party versus having a new party aren't actually two different strategies. Those are just two different possible outcomes of the same strategy, which is you could build up a strong enough Democratic Socialist kind of wing within the Democratic Party that either it would be able to take over, or as it tried to, the Democratic Party would just break apart and it would become a new major party. So that would be my take on that.
I think there's also voter failure that's come with this, which is that we don't punish incumbents that are unpopular. Like just historically, there just isn't evidence that we punish incumbents. And I think voters have to realize that, we can punish incumbents. And like, you know what I mean? And like start accepting primary challengers for any of this to even work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that right. I think you have to do it at this stage through primaries, because otherwise it's a collective action problem. It's like it's like that scene in Jerry Maguire, right? When he gets up, who's with me, right? Yeah. Who's gonna leave with me? And nobody leaves. That you like, if you're trying to do the third party thing within a general election right now, it ends up kind of being like that, right? Everybody in DSA could get up for the who's with me, and it would be a tiny, tiny little sliver of the vote. It would just collapse again. So I think that, again, you need to have like really build up these Bernie crack kinds of forces. I think you'd really need to do, to rebuild the labor movement, so you'd have those like union, like shock troops, for a revitalized left. And I know all this is much easier to say than to do, but I'm just saying, like, you can't just will a new party into existence. Those are the conditions that would actually have to exist to make that happen. Observer says in Super Chat, Catalyst article, economic origins of mass incarceration, talks about the pressure, post-war, so I guess that's post-Vietnam War, crime wave created for draconian crackdowns. Even people like Bernie were forced to bow to that pressure. Yeah, right. Like I think that's exactly right. Even Bernie, with the crime bill in the 90s, he gave some speeches like denouncing the parts of it about, mass incarceration, but then he ended up voting for it because it is attached to the Violence Against Women Act, and he wasn't willing to take the hit, politically for voting against that. And I mean, whatever. I mean, that's certainly a black mark on his record, but it's also I think it also says something about how intense that was at this point, that like even somebody like him, who is about as good as as politicians with real power get on these issues, still caved under those circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And it was really, I mean, politically, attaching it to the Violence Against Women Act was really genius, because it becomes kind of, so not only does it become impossible not to vote for it because, there is this like weird consensus created, but, for your liberal bona fides, I guess, it becomes impossible not to vote for the Violence Against Women Act, because all of a sudden, not only are you against, criminals being put away, which, it incenses the right, but like they can push it later so that you're against women being protected, which, which would be a backlash from the left.
Yeah, no, for sure. All right. So look, this is, I said an hour ago we'd cut it early tonight, and then we got caught up in all of this stuff. So if people want to ask another question, we can maybe squeeze in one more question, but otherwise, let's wrap it up. Of course, Outlaws and Revolutionaries is normally supposed to be about the end of it. So just to have a nice note like that to end the show on, we're doing Wolf of Wall Street on Wednesday. Have you actually?
Yeah, that should be really fun. that should be a really fun time doing Wolf of Wall Street after the whole GameStop thing.
Yeah, you watched it the other night, right?
Yeah, but I'm probably gonna watch scenes from it again before that. I also downloaded the audiobook of it. I guess it's only 4 hours, but I haven't delved into that yet. It's been a really couple of days.
Nice. All right. Yeah, no, I saw it. I haven't seen it again. I'm probably going to see it tomorrow night. I saw it in the theater, when it first came out, and obviously, that was a lot of fun to watch under any circumstances. Arik asks, what's better, Casino or Wolf of Wall Street? I think I'd still say Casino, but Wolf of Wall Street is a very good movie.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, unfortunately, somebody asked if we were watching it live on the stream. Unfortunately, we can't do that. The YouTube hammer would come down on us pretty hard.
Within seconds.
But if you watch it yourself, in between now and Wednesday, we'll be talking about it. We'll be talking about it on Wednesday, and like I said, it's always a fun movie to watch, and a particularly timely one after the whole GameStop thing. So lots to talk about there. That's going to be me, Forrest, Daniel Bessner, Ryan Lake, and Micah Utrecht. So that should be a lot of fun. On Sunday, we are continuing the Sunday night debate breakdown live streams by watching Roger Scruton versus Terry Eagleton. And on Monday, I'm going to be debating Adam Kokesh live on air, and then I'm going to be chatting with Jason Miles from the This Is Revolution podcast. Okay. Quick super chat question before we go. Charles Raintree asks, has Griscom done Loretta Lynn? If not, would you ask him to? No on one, yes on two. I think that would be fun. There's a podcast I like about the history of country music called Cocaine and Rhinestones, which is actually put out by David Allan Coe's son. And I remember there being a good Loretta Lynn episode there. So lots to talk about. So good idea. But meanwhile, let us cut it there for tonight, because it has been about 3 hours, and coming out of that 5-hour live stream last night. So I will see everybody back here on Wednesday. Left is